Sam. Wood elves.
Think of elves. Now, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? The ears, the hair, the attire, or the fact that for some reason, elves are usually portrayed as culturally refined, better than us, mere mortals. But why is that? Where does the aristocratic representation of the elven race come from, and why do they sound so posh?
Men are weak. The race of men is failing.
The blood of Numenor is all but spent, its pride and dignity forgotten. It is because of men the ring survives.
So before we answer these burning questions, let's start with a simple one. What's an elf?
What's an elf?
Do you want to answer that?
I know that I steered our conversation to high fantasy elven lore, but the term elf has been used for hundreds of years in European folklore. According to elf mythology, since the 1500s, an elf was a name for a small and mischievous being, something like Dobby from Harry Potter series, a children-stealing creature.
Dobby?
Master has given Dobby a sock.
What? I didn't...
Master has presented Dobby with clothes. Dobby is free.
Now, in Germanic folklore, an elf was originally considered a spirit, later evolving into a small human-like creature. But it was more like a fairy similar to Tinkerbell than, Elrond from Lord of the Rings. There was a distinction between light elves and dark elves, similar to the Scottish folklore of the Silly Court, which are benevolent fairies, and the Unsilly Court, which are malevolent fairies. And again, we have the description of cheeky, unpredictable creatures that would replace children with changelings, would cause diseases in people and animals like cattle, or give us nightmares by sitting on our chests during sleep. So a far cry from the nobility of Rivendell.
I sincerely hope you bring me good news.
The fathers are committed to the match.
We have waited many years for this moment.
Then, in Norse mythology, we have Dolkalfar, meaning dark elves, and Yolsalfar, meaning light elves, the mysterious supernatural creatures. Dark elves live underground, and light elves live in Alfheimr, the land of elves.
Long before the birth of light, there was darkness. And from that darkness came the dark elves. Millennia ago, the most ruthless of their kind, Malekith, sought to transform our universe back into one of eternal night.
Now, the elves are mentioned in the 13th century Old Norse myths book, Prose Edda, which was compiled and written by Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson. In Norse myths, elves are somewhat closer to the high elves we appreciate. They are connected to nature, join gods in war and council, and are hypothesized to be more like demigods, supernatural beings. But they're not very nice, right? They're cunning, they're vengeful, and sometimes haunting burial mounds. They could have been the templates for later demons and devils who come with Christianity. So given the extensive myths about the elves, shouldn't their accents be from Central Europe or Scandinavia or even Poland, like the elves in a classic Polish adaptation of The Witcher?
Przyjmijcie godnie naszą decyzję. Musimy was zabić z czystej konieczności.
Maybe not. Let's not do that again. It's probably not too offensive to say that the idea of posh-speaking elves come because of the father of modern fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien created several Elvish languages and writing systems, Tengwar and Cirith, Quenya being the most developed language of High Elves. It was inspired by the Finnish, but also includes elements of Latin and Greek. The poem Namaria, also known as Galadriel's Lament, is in Quenya and is the longest Quenya text in the Lord of the Rings. We can hear a part of it when the Fellowship leaves Lothlorien in Peter Jackson's film.
I give you the light of Erenir, our most beloved star.
We can also hear it at the end of the episode 4 of Rings of Power Season 2 when Ada speaks it to Galadriel. At least what it says when we put on subtitles. So it's curious why they used the language in this scene.
Ellen sila lumen o mentielvo, heruni altariel.
However, Sindarin is the spoken language of the elves who remained in Middle-earth, and it's based on Welsh and Celtic languages. And there are also several other Elven languages that Tolkien created. Telerin's used by Sea Elves, Noldorin, Sylvan is used by Wood Elves and Navarin, and all of these are based on the two already mentioned, Quenya and Sindarin. We also have Vaniarin, was also inspired by Welsh and has a soft, ethereal sound. Okay, this is not a deep dive into Tolkien's Elven languages, but even looking at that summary, right, it doesn't seem, at least to me, like he wanted them to speak in a proper British accent. Tolkien elves are ethereal, distant, wise, above human squabbles. At least that's how we got to see them in a movie trilogy, in the adaptations, right? I'm a fan of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, but I'm not an expert by any means, so forgive my shallow summary of his works. But when we bring it back to the accent of elves, it kinda goes back to the UK. And in the UK, where I live, accents vary greatly by region or even city. They are also associated with social class, and some people judge others based on their accents.
Tomorrow. 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 Tomorrow.
And as we already established, elves, the modern high fantasy elves, if put in a real world, in our world, could be an upper class, an aristocratic race. Therefore, we gave them an accent associated with that part of society. So, like in Rings of Power, orcs and humans who serve Ada have a strong regional accent.
Your Majesty.
What he said, Lord Father. Sauron could never return, could he?
While Halbrand or Sauron, when he pretends to be a royal human, he has a soft, posh accent.
An army of orcs moves against men. We were the fortunate ones.
Perhaps the fortunate ones were the first to die.
The accents are used to indicate social class, education, and wealth.
The nobles from the north are here. Seems Lord Belzegar has come to pay his respects.
One cannot pay what one does not have.
So even though Tolkien created Lord of the Rings and his languages as part of the mythology, in his books we don't get an alignment with our languages or accents. When filmmakers decided to bring these stories to life, they had to decide how to match the personalities and the settings. Tolkien gave us the detailed descriptions of the world and its people, but he didn't describe the accents. And I think Tolkien's Englishness could have played a role in developing depictions of high elves, even if he didn't intend to. Ultimately, elves got a fancy look and a fancy sound when turned into radio plays, animation, and finally, live-action movies.
The Uruks turn northeast! They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!
Peter Jackson's trilogy solidified the trope, and it's difficult to change it now.
You've been summoned here to answer the threat of Mordor.
Even dark elves from the MCU couldn't shake it off.
Death would have come to you soon enough.
Not by your hand.
Your universe was never meant to be.
Alright, so let's say we got this idea of high-value elf. What human language could we give them? Or accent if we agree that they speak English, especially, in Western or Hollywood productions? Well, there is only one option, and that's where RP comes in. RP, or received pronunciation, is a British standard speech, educated speech.
The truth. It makes a mockery of even the central tenets of Christianity.
And according to Britannica, RP can also be referred to as Queen's or King's English or BBC English. And that's because in 1922, BBC chose RP as its broadcasting standard, partly because it's a neutral and widely understood kind of English.
Hello, 2LO calling, 2LO calling.
November the 14th, 1922, and the beginning of the BBC.
But then I guess saying it's a neutral accent is somewhat controversial, because RP is similar to dialects from South-East England, as well as the South-East Midland Golden Triangle of universities of Cambridge, Oxford or London. The fancy ones. So it's not really that neutral.
You and your wife ambushing me everywhere I go, with anxious looks in your eyes wanting to talk.
I do want to talk, Mummy.
It's associated with the British royal family and aristocracy, so when we make modern elves speak English, that's the obvious way to portray them. Now, I wouldn't say when they speak it's an exact replica of RP speech, but it still sounds more refined than other dialects when they speak English.
There are many ways to kill an orc. Come at me. We will see who can score flesh.
And the Elven inspiration from British monarchy is clear to Dominic Watt, a senior lecturer in forensic speech science at the University of York, who said, and I quote, "If you want people to seem like they are the wisest and they surpass the races of men and they're immortal, I can imagine that they are not going to give them West Country accents like they give hobbits."
Some may imagine that a noble quest is at hand. A quest to reclaim a homeland and slay a dragon.
So from the very early Lord of the Rings radio plays, elves had a high-born English accent, placing the fantasy characters as if they would live in a real world. At least, making it easy for us to imagine where in society they would sit. At the fancy table, of course. And there's also a distinction between a heightened RP and a sort of normal RP, heightened being more posh, like the one from The Crown.
Fine, let's talk. Might I request we do it like privy councillors? On our feet, to keep it brief.
And I wouldn't say high fantasy elves use heightened RP. Some do, but it sounds kind of old-fashioned, so I guess it's in between. It's not always the case that elves must use RP when they speak English. And for example, in the American fantasy drama The Shannara Chronicles, the elves speak with a neutral American accent.
I thought you were teaching her how to fence. She was a quick study.
But at the same time, when we hear the king, he still speaks in a British accent, to give him that regal sound.
Congratulations. As king, I welcome you to the Order of the Chosen.
Leaving Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power aside, the trend continues in a new series like Netflix The Witcher, based on Polish novels by Andrzej Sapkowski.
The elves were one of the original races on the continent. They acquired the magic first, but the humans pushed them out of their lands.
The Elven culture in which places an emphasis on naturalism and living in harmony with the land, but we also get urban elves who tend to be artists or scholars.
Today we reclaim Aretusa as our own, and we bring the Elder Blood Princess home.
They share similar traits to elves from Tolkien. They are one of the elder races, mostly live away from humans, they face prejudice, and they have a distinctive posh English accent.
My elders worked with humans and got robbed of all they had. And when they fought back, they were slaughtered.
So even though the series got its fair share of criticism, it reinforces how elves should look and sound. They're not as fancy as the ones in The Lord of the Rings, though. So at the beginning of the video, I asked you, what pops into your mind when you think of elves? But I think it's a tricky question, right? I think of high fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Baldur's Gate, all that kind of stuff. You know, immortal race, wise, elder race.
Sire, please.
But if I ask a child, they would probably say something like Santa's elf. Small, mischievous, with a childlike personality.
You stink. I think you're gonna have a good Christmas, all right?
You smell like beef and cheese. You don't smell like Santa.
Or even Harry Potter ones, which are, I guess they are a darker version of Santa's helpers.
Dobby saw a creature in Diagon Alley, which Dobby thought was curious. And then Dobby heard creature mention Harry Potter's name.
So there isn't just one answer to this. However, I do think when it comes to an adult fantasy world, the perception of the posh-speaking, fancy elf with an arrogant attitude toward us humans is the default, and we can thank the Brits for that. Like and subscribe, thanks for watching.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?